You're listening to the Ascent Kinetics podcast by Treeline Endurance, where we explore the new science of exercise for health and performance. We'll keep it short and sweet and should fit everything in before the end of your commute. I am your host, Greg Marshall. I'm a coach, educator, and researcher. I've helped athletes build all the way from zero fitness to huge feats of athleticism, a journey that I myself started on 13 years ago. The content covered here is an expanded audio format, the content appearing on our blog at treelineendurance.com. A couple of years ago, I did some physiology testing for the United States biathlon team. If you're working with the world's greatest athletes in any discipline, naturally you expect them to be quite different from the rest of us. And they are, because they're the world's best at what they do. But it can be easy to look at an athlete in an arena or on a screen and see them as more different from the rest of us than they really are. Getting to know these folks a little bit better, there were a few things that stood out to me, and they weren't the things that I expected to be different. Their physiology was unquestionably next level. They obviously could move much faster than the rest of us before they hit any measure of fatigue that would bankrupt any of us. It was more than that, though, because they could push well beyond that level of fatigue and to levels that most of us can't imagine. Lactate levels in the mid-teens, blackouts, things like that. The diet was unremarkable. Our sports science team ate the same cafeteria food that the athletes did during that week-long training camp, and it was fine, not unique in nutrient profile or ingredient list, even at an Olympic training facility. The weirdest thing was the degree of calm in these people. When they were in their street clothes, they seemed as if they didn't really have a care in the world. They weren't worried about competitor footage. They weren't planning their next training block or anything like that. They were talking about vacations to Vermont, hanging out with a friend on the weekend. Maybe they'd take a nap later today. No sign of the beast until they were strapped to a pair of skis. Elite sport is a job and a demanding one. It's not easy to be the best, especially at what these people do. And the very best, it seemed, excelled at turning it off when they weren't punched in. I think that's worth remembering. Influencers, media, movies, and hustle culture in general are telling us that every minute not dedicated to our pursuit is time lost and an edge to our competitors. But when I hear that, I just like to think about what the best biathletes do. Moving into our topic for today, I spent a good amount of time these last 2 years researching what developments have occurred in footwear over the last really 40 years. And pretty quickly, one innovation boils to the surface, something called advanced footwear technology. The rest of us more likely just know these as carbon-plated racing shoes, if we've heard of them. My research at the time focused on the specific influences of these shoes on female athletes, but I came across a few adjacent topics that I didn't really have time to dive into during that work. That sort of set the stage for this piece. One of the things I noticed was that there's very little research available on how super shoes might impact trail runners. I thought it was interesting because as a trail runner, I knew that many brands were already offering trail running shoes that had carbon plates. It seemed kind of curious because the entire selling point of a carbon plated racing shoe is that the road versions of these had been lab validated, meaning researchers had put forth convincing evidence that these shoes make a measurable performance difference. But just because the shoe has been validated for road running doesn't necessarily mean that the same is true for the trail. If you've run in trails, then you know there's a lot of reason to think that things are actually quite different on a trail. So I did a bit more digging and found out what the research was really saying on that topic. This takes us into the blog content for this week. Super shoes have taken over elite road and track running in the decade since they first emerged with Nike's invention of the Vaporfly 4%. Decades of running shoes were sold on big promises for performance or injury mitigation, but the 4% stood out as the first one to hold up under scrutiny in a laboratory. The team at the University of Colorado Boulder published their 2018 paper titled A Comparison of the Energetic Costs of Running in Marathon Racing Shoes, and when they did, they foreshadowed what was to come, a generation of new world records on the road and the track, and a new paradigm in what the shoe on your foot could do for your own performance. The glaring omission in all of this was, what do these shoes mean for trail runners? Briefly, we'll review what makes a super shoe what it is. Sometimes they're also called advanced footwear technology, AFT, or a few other things. There are really three defining components, and in no particular order, those are: one, a rocker geometry that helps you roll from heel to toe while your foot is on the ground. The second is a rigid moderator, typically a carbon plate. Sometimes they use nylon as well. And three, a special foam called polyether block amide, which is exceptionally light and springy and composes the majority of the midsole of that shoe. The properties of a super shoe make a lot of sense for a runner who is traveling more or less in a constant direction and on a flat and level surface. All three features allow them to take up energy from the foot as it impacts the ground and then spring that energy back at toe off. The problem with the trail scenario is that we're rarely traveling in a straightforward direction. Instead, we're running up and down steep grades over lots of switchbacks with rocks and roots. Does a shoe that stores energy the way a super shoe does even make sense for the way trail runners move? Research on trail running can be hard to do. Simulating rocks and roots, switchbacks, naturally pose challenges in a laboratory setting for pretty apparent reasons. A 2026 study led by Graham Askew at the University of Leeds had runners try running in super shoes on a treadmill at a few different grades of steepness with the goal of assessing changes in oxygen consumption across those inclines. If super shoes work well at minimizing oxygen consumption on hills the way they do on flat terrain, then we should expect somewhere in the neighborhood of a 4 or 5% savings in oxygen compared to a standard EVA-based running shoe. Instead, what Askew and the team found is that the benefits of super shoes decrease as the grade gets steeper. At a 3% grade, the 4% savings of flat terrain had now dropped to only 2.5% savings. At a 9% uphill grade, which is still relatively tame by trail and mountain running standards, the benefit of the super shoe was down to fractions of a percent. The more traditional EVA-based shoe worked just as well at a 9 to 10% grade as AFT, so trail runners might not find them worth their money, at least not on the climb. So what about downhill running? The shoes could still be worth it in trail running if, for some reason, they're able to save more of our energy on the downhills. Another study out of University of Canberra, led by Melissa Mizeau, examined the shoe across 3 other conditions: a steep uphill grade, a steep downhill grade, and flat terrain. They didn't use a full-fledged super shoe, instead using a shoe with no carbon plate but still with that PIBA foam. The Askew study suggests that we shouldn't expect much in the uphill condition, and we should already know what to expect on flat conditions from previous research. Mizeau's results aligned with expectations in both of those categories, but in the downhill conditions, super shoes still offered little to no savings in oxygen consumption. Those results make a lot of sense. If shoes are springs giving us energy as we run along, that's not necessarily a benefit when we're just descending a steep slope. We put less energy into propelling ourselves forward and more energy into slowing ourselves down as we gracefully, or not so gracefully, make our way down the hill. Oxygen consumption will naturally drop as we start to descend. In other words, shoes that spring us forward may not work for us when we're putting most of our energy into trying to slow ourselves down. So what does it mean in terms of a cultural shift for trail running towards super shoes? The data on current super shoe designs doesn't look promising. Then again, these shoes were always designed with the road and the track in mind. There are a few other details to consider. For one, the same issue with representation shows up in these studies as in the majority of footwear research. Among the total 30 subjects involved in these 2 studies, all of the subjects were male. It's not entirely clear how that might affect a female in the same footwear conditions. It's also worth considering new shoe prototypes that made appearances at the Western States 100 this year. We don't have the details of those shoe designs, but we saw record-breaking performances in a couple of them. We're also not privy to the internal research and development occurring at Nike, Hoka, or any number of other shoe brands, but we know that it's happening. At the start of this year, Wouter Hoogkamer, a 10-year faculty researcher at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, left his position and started a new role at Hoka as the Director of Applied Research. This is interesting because Wouter Hoogkamer led the very first study validating super shoe benefits for the road. Third, it's worth also remembering the nature of trail running. Races tend to be long enough that there's reason to ask whether metabolic savings actually have a benefit over, say, 100 miles. Things that are more likely to matter in those scenarios are whether or not runners experience heat, gut issues, blisters from ill-fitting shoes, or other unwanted effects associated with things like sleep deprivation. If all of these were held equal, though, a couple of percentage points in oxygen savings still matters. And as elites are getting more dialed in all of those other elements, metabolic savings is again going to become a pretty significant concern on the elite stage in ultra running. It's unlikely that it will look the same as it does on the road and the track, but we haven't seen or heard the last of super shoes for trail running just yet. If you enjoyed this episode, you can show your support by sharing it with a friend or training partner and by giving us a quick rating on the streaming service of your choice. You can also sign up for our newsletter at treelineendurance.com to receive our monthly review and other exclusive content. If you want to take your support to the next level, you can contribute at the link in the show notes. This goes a long way towards helping us bring more insights on the science of exercise for health and performance. This podcast is brought to you by Treeline Endurance. See you next time here on Ascent Kinetics.